This week, if you draw every day, you will be able to understand the difference in space, shape, and planes, understand and use several methods to measure proportions, understand the perception of relationship in space, and use techniques to create the illusion of depth on a two-dimensional surface. Here are some of the projects you will be working on this week. Set your timer for 1 hour and draw a self-portrait in your hand in the same position as the first time. How do artists create the illusion of space on a flat surface? This week, we will begin to talk about the element of space and give you some problem-solving skills to help you ensure that your subject matter shows good proportion and scale. You will be able to understand and explain foreground, middle ground, and background on a two-dimensional surface and use the knowledge gained in activities to complete projects, showing us how you can create the illusion of space. Let's start off with a talk about some things you can do to ensure that what you create has sensible proportion and scale. There are several ways an artist can measure subject matter to ensure good proportion and scale. What is the difference between proportion and scale? When someone speaks of proportion, they are referring to how big or small each part is compared to a whole. How big is this person's hands compared to the feet, face, or arms? How big are his feet compared to his wrist to elbow ratio? How long are his arms compared to his legs? The same can be applied to an inanimate object. How big are the tires compared to the body of the car? How tall is the car compared to the length of the car? How big are the front windows compared to the passenger's window? Proportions are important because they need to be believable to sell the subject matter. Once you understand proportion, you can exaggerate to add to the appeal of your character or design. In the end, it just needs to be believable. Another issue to think about when designing individual objects is the scale of everything in your scene. Is it believable? Scale refers to individual objects and how they relate to each other. Scale changes depending on what the artist draws first. There are several methods that an artist can use to help with proportion and scale. We will cover 4 easy ways for you to make sure you are on the right track: grids, using a viewfinder, sight measuring, and plumb lines. Artists may use different terminology when discussing these, but you will find that all are talking about using the same methods. Albrecht Dürer was one of the greatest artists of the Northern Renaissance and was very much an innovator. He is, for example, the first artist who is known to have painted a self-portrait and to have done a landscape painting of a specific scene. He also is the artist that invented the grid machine. The artists of the Renaissance were trying to produce realistic paintings and sculpture of what was around them and needed help with visual problem solving. The grid started as a mechanism that was placed between the artist and the subject matter, helping the artist to solve proportional, scale, and perspective issues. These mechanisms can be purchased today in all forms. You can make your own grid as well using Photoshop. You can also use the transparency to create your own grid as well. Grids help the artist with understanding the space in which they work and proportions of the subject matter. Translating real or three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional surface doesn't have to be the hardest thing to learn. In fact, once you get used to drawing from real life, it becomes much more enjoyable than drawing from a photograph. Viewfinders are a way that the artist can check the perspective and the scale of their subject matter. Making and using a viewfinder will help you understand what the picture plane is and how it operates in drawing. The picture plane can be thought of as an imaginary pane of glass directly in front of and between the artist and the subject matter. The paper and the picture plane are the same thing. Open your sketchbook so that you have two facing pages. Draw a series of circles on each side. On the left side of your sketchbook, fill in the circles with whatever you want. Make a flat design using any methods you want. Remember that you can change the line size and width, and you can use value building techniques that enhance your design. On the right side of your sketchbook, try to show depth. Overlap some of the circles, add value, and change the size and placement. Look at the two drawings side by side. Did you create the illusion of depth? How did you accomplish this? Look at the drawing on the left. Did you create something interesting to look at? You can use a piece of cardboard or thick paper to make your own viewfinder. Cut out an opening in the middle of an 8.5 by 11 piece. The opening in your viewfinder should be approximately the same shape as your picture plane. You can go a step further and use string to divide the viewfinder horizontally and vertically. Use the viewfinder to solve visual problems by looking at the negative space and the scale of the objects related to each other. Use the viewfinder to help you study the negative space in and around an ordinary chair. Hold the frame so the edges of the chair touch the edges of the frame. Draw the shapes of the negative spaces in and around the chair. Fill in the negative space with the value and leave the positive space empty. Plumb lines in sight measuring are key when correcting proportions and scale after you have drawn an initial gesture. Plumb lines are drawn either horizontally or vertically, and sometimes drawn through the center of the object. Using these lines, you can measure scale and placement of your objects. You can also make measurements to check accuracy in proportion and scale. This correction method is known as sight measurement. Measure the object in your composition that is closest to you. Now, measure this object against the other object in the composition and make corrections as needed. You will continuously need to look back and forth between your subject matter and drawing to ensure accuracy. There are two ways to use plumb lines. The first way is by drawing vertical and horizontal lines that mark off key points in the drawing. After a gesture is drawn, it is important to study the objects in real life and see what needs to be corrected on your page. You might also note key relationships of these objects. This is where the horizontal plumb lines would come into play. The vertical plumb lines might help in keeping the vertical lines on the page straight, helping the objects appear grounded. The other way to use plumb lines is to find out the size of one object in relation to another object. This is also a great way to draw a perfect sphere. You can draw a vertical line down the middle of a sphere to measure the height and then rotate that line to create a horizontal line in order to check the width of the sphere. What is the next step once you have used plumb lines to find your mistakes? Do you redraw the entire subject matter? You could, but you could also use something we call construction shapes to move forward with completing your work. Using the plumb lines, we can correct the drawing with construction shapes. These shapes begin to break down the form into simple segments. Notice we have continued the shapes out even when it is hidden by another object. This is a great way to recheck the proportions and spacing of the objects. Construction shapes are very helpful for more complex objects as well. In this example, we have gestured out a Windex bottle. We used plumb lines to mark important points of the object, and now we have used more simplified construction shapes to figure out and correct the more complex Windex bottle. Here is the corrected gesture, and with a little refinement can easily turn into a finished contour drawing. Pick one of the 5 photographs and use any method you have learned to recreate the subject matter as best you can. Show the correct value, proportion, and scale by comparing your final piece to the photograph. Some of you may think it would be easier and faster to try and trace the photograph. However, you are taking this class to learn to draw, so you must draw it, not trace it. Write a paragraph or two on what you have learned that you didn't know before this class began. There are terms you will hear when artists are speaking about the illusion of depth. Let's go over some of these terms and do some activities that will help you remember them. The surface of a painting or drawing is sometimes called the picture plane. The part of the picture plane that is nearest to you is called the foreground. The part that appears furthest away is the background. The area in between is called the middle ground. When one object covers part of a second object, the first seems to be closer to the viewer. This only works if the objects are opaque. If you try to make the objects transparent, the illusion of depth disappears. Large objects appear to be closer to the viewer than small objects. The further an object is from you, the smaller it will appear. Objects that are placed either low or high on the picture plane seem to be closer to the viewer than objects placed closer to eye level. Objects with clear, sharp edges and visible details seem to be closer to you. As details blur or become lighter, they seem to be further away. Brightly colored objects seem closer to you, and objects that lose their saturation by becoming dull or lighter will appear further away. This is called atmospheric perspective and is caused by pollution, dust, and moisture in the air. The more air between you and the subject matter or object, the more the object appears to fade. Create 3 different designs on 3 separate sheets of paper. Each design should contain 5 forms or shapes. Use the same 5 forms or shapes in each of the designs. Draw all the items as close to the foreground as possible. Draw one item close to the foreground and make the others look as if they are slightly further back. Draw one item close to the foreground, one far into the background, and the other 3 in the midground. Write a paragraph in your sketchbook describing what you have learned about the illusion of depth. Let's look at some simple landscapes. You will notice that without value and just a few simple lines that we have created a foreground, middle ground, and background. However, it is flat and has no illusion of depth. Understanding and using atmospheric perspective in your work is imperative to creating believable space. In your sketchbook, draw 8 to 10 small rectangles that you will use as your picture planes. In the first rectangle, use 3 simple lines to create a fore, middle, and background. Then, in the remaining boxes, copy the lines as best you can and fill each part of the picture plane with either a dark, medium, or light value. How does changing the value add to the illusion of depth? Does changing the value add a mood to the simple landscape? You have completed several tasks that have introduced you to the illusion of depth, and with practice, this information will begin to make more sense to you. Remember, changing the size and placement will create shallow depth. Adding changes to the saturation, color, and focus creates atmospheric perspective, which adds to the illusion you are trying to create. The term perspective comes from the Latin word prospectus, meaning to look forward. Linear perspective was perfected during the Renaissance by European artists. Traditional Renaissance perspective conforms most closely to the way people in the Western culture perceive objects in space. Learning to draw in perspective requires that we see things as they are. We need to put things into perspective and into proportion. This process requires the capacity to see the relationship in various parts of a visual problem. Skillful sighting of proportion and perspective causes edges, spaces, relationships, lights, and shadows to come together with visual logic. Clear perception of these relationships enables us to depict what we see onto a flat surface. Seeing or sighting is all about comparison. What is the angle compared to a vertical? How big is the sphere compared to the square? How wide is the door compared to the length? Angles are compared to the constant vertical and horizontal, and sizes are compared to the first object you draw. We can call this the basic or main unit. Let's look at a few examples of this concept, and how an artist can use this method to see and measure relationships. Look at this window. The width of the window can be a unit. Use this length to measure other parts of the window. How long is the window compared to the width? You can use this unit to measure every part of your drawing. Let's look at another example. If you were to draw this table, you must learn how to see relationships on a picture plane. We know that the table appears differently depending on our viewpoint. Get a pencil to begin to sight relationships. Gesture the table without thinking about getting absolute proportions. Measure the closest part of the table and then begin to use this basic main unit to measure the rest of the table you have drawn, correcting as you go. In sighting proportions, you find out the real-world ratios and are able to remeasure and complete a drawing no matter the size that has believable proportions. Set yourself up in a chair at least 10 feet away from a doorway with your sketchbook, pencil, and transparency. Divide the transparency into 4 quadrants. Practice drawing what is in front of you by doing 3 to 5 gestures. Once you are comfortable with the subject matter, take your time and draw one last light gesture. Do not worry about proportions at this time. Take your viewfinder or transparency and hold it up so that you can see the entire doorway. On the transparency, draw a line across the top of the door. This will be your basic or main unit. Use your pencil to make the change in size of the top of the door on your paper. Use your extra pencil to find the proportional relationships and ratio. By sighting the doorway, you will determine the width to height proportion. You will now use this method to measure and change the relationship of each part of your drawing. Find an outdoor scene that offers subject matter both in the foreground and background. Distant forms should appear light and less distinct than objects that are near you. Exaggerate the value differences between foreground and background in order to create the illusion of depth.